My name is Stephen Jack, 38 years old, and I just walked into my 20-year high school reunion wearing a $12 t-shirt from Target and jeans I've had for 5 years. Within 10 minutes, 3 different people had made jokes about my Walmart wardrobe. What they didn't know was that I'd personally written the $75,000 check that paid for this entire event. I pulled into the parking lot of the Grandview Country Club at exactly 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the official start time. Not because I was running late, but because arriving fashionably late had never been my style. I preferred arriving when I meant to arrive. My 2019 Honda Civic looked modest among the BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas scattered across the lot, but that didn't bother me. I'd learned long ago that the car in your driveway says more about your priorities than your bank account. The venue was impressive, I had to admit. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the 18th green. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors, and servers in crisp white uniforms moved between guests carrying silver trays. It was exactly the kind of place our class had dreamed about back when we were 17, and thought success meant expensive things in expensive places. Stephen Jack. The voice belonged to Miranda Wells, though it took me a moment to recognize her. 20 years have been kind to her, but more than that, she clearly invested heavily in making sure they had been. Her dress probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past year, and her jewelry caught the light, like small spotlights announcing her presence. "Miranda," I said, extending my hand. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, and I could see her eyes doing a quick inventory of my outfit. Faded Levi's, gray t-shirt with a small pocket, white sneakers that had seen better days, but were still perfectly functional. "You look exactly the same," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I love how you're so authentic, not try to impress anyone." "Comfort's important to me," I replied, which was true. I'd stopped caring about impressing people around the time I realized that the people worth impressing were usually too busy doing meaningful work to notice what I was wearing. Before Miranda could respond, Brad Morrison appeared at her shoulder like he'd been summoned. Brad had been our class president, star quarterback, and the kind of guy who'd probably peaked at 18, but was still living off the momentum. His suit was expensive, but trying too hard. His watch caught the light aggressively, and his smile had the practiced quality of someone who sold things for a living. "Holy shit, Steve," he said, loud enough to turn heads. "Didn't you get the memo? This isn't Casual Friday, buddy." The small group around us chuckled, that polite laugh people give when someone says something that's supposed to be funny but mostly just feels mean. I nodded and smiled slightly, the way I'd learned to do when people mistook kindness for weakness. "I must have missed that email," I said. "Seriously, though," Brad continued, apparently encouraged by the chuckles. "Did you come straight from work? Please tell me you don't work weekends." "I don't work weekends," I said truthfully. I didn't work most weekdays either, but that wasn't information Brad needed. Jessica joined our growing circle, and I could see the exact moment she processed my appearance. Jessica had been class valedictorian, student council president, and the kind of person who'd organize her life around achievements that looked good on applications. She'd married a lawyer, according to the reunion newsletter, and lived in what the real estate websites probably called an exclusive community. "Stephen," she said, her voice carrying that tone people use when they're trying to be diplomatic about something they find disappointing. "It's so refreshing to see someone who's comfortable with where they are in life." There it was. 3 different ways of saying the same thing. "You look poor, and we want you to know we've noticed." The truth was, I understood their perspective. In high school, I'd been the quiet kid who wore hand-me-downs from my older brother and worked weekends at the grocery store to help my mom with bills. My dad had left when I was 14, and while my mom did her best as a nurse's aide, there wasn't much left over for the kind of clothes that made you blend in with the kids who had everything. I'd eaten lunch in the computer lab most days, not because I was antisocial, but because that's where I felt at home. While other kids were worried about who was dating whom or which parties they'd been invited to, I was teaching myself programming languages and building websites for local businesses. $50 here, $100 there. Enough to buy my own clothes and maybe take a girl to a movie without having to ask my mom for money. I prefer investing in experiences over clothes, I said, which made Miranda laugh. That's such a sweet way to put it, she said, and I could hear the condescension dripping from every word. As we talked, I found myself studying them the way I'd learned to study systems and code, looking for patterns, understanding how the pieces fit together. Miranda kept touching her necklace when she mentioned her real estate business, the way people do when they're not entirely confident about what they're saying. Brad checked his phone constantly, responding to what were probably work emails on a Saturday night, which suggested either dedication or desperation. Jessica mentioned her husband 3 times in 5 minutes, but never mentioned what she did, which usually meant she was defining herself entirely through someone else's achievements. "So, what are you up to these days, Steve?" Brad asked, and I could tell he was expecting an answer that would justify their assumptions about my net worth based on my wardrobe. "I do some work in technology," I said. "Consulting, investing, that kind of thing." "That's cool," Miranda said with the tone people use when they're not really listening. "Tech support can be really stable work." I nodded. Let them think what they wanted to think. In my experience, people revealed more about themselves when they felt like they had the upper hand. As our conversation continued, I noticed other classmates gravitating toward our group, drawn by the familiar dynamic of successful people surrounding someone they perceived as less successful. It was like watching a nature documentary about pack behavior. "The venue is incredible," someone said, "though I have to say $150 per person seemed pretty steep for a reunion." "Seriously," Brad agreed. "My wife was not happy about that price tag, but Miranda said it was the only place available." Miranda's cheek twitched slightly. "Well, you get what you pay for, and the committee felt like we deserved something special for our 20th. I listened to them complain about the cost, while simultaneously trying to impress each other with how little the money meant to them. It was fascinating psychology, really. The people who could truly afford it weren't talking about money at all, while the people stretching to be here couldn't stop mentioning the expense. "Stephen," a voice called from across the room, and I turned to see Robert Martinez approaching. Robert had been the hotel manager when I had first contacted the venue about hosting the reunion. He was a professional, discreet man who understood that some conversations were meant to stay private. "Mr. Jack," he said as he reached our group, "I wanted to check that everything is to your satisfaction this evening." The conversation around us stopped. Miranda, Brad, and Jessica all looked between Robert and me with confused expressions. "Everything looks perfect," I said. "Thank you for making sure the setup went smoothly." "Of course. And the scholarship presentation is scheduled for 9 p.m. as you requested. The recipients are here and very excited to meet you." Robert excused himself, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than it should have. "Scholarship presentation?" Jessica asked. "The hotel staff seems to know you pretty well," Miranda observed, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "I've done some work with them before," I said, which was true. I'd also funded the renovation of their conference center 2 years ago, but that wasn't information they needed either. Brad's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the practiced motion of someone checking for rescue from an uncomfortable conversation. Instead, his face went pale. "What is it?" Jessica asked. "My wife just sent me an article," he said slowly, "about some tech guy from our hometown who sold his company for $47 million. The silence stretched longer this time. "That's nice," Miranda said carefully. "Good for him." "The guy's name is Stephen Jack," Brad continued, his voice getting quieter. "From our graduating class." I watched their faces as the information processed. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the dawning realization that maybe they'd been operating with incomplete information. "There must be lots of Stephen Jacks," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Before anyone could respond, Principal Davidson appeared at my shoulder. Mrs. Davidson had been the assistant principal when we graduated, but she'd moved up over the years. She was one of the people I'd stayed in touch with, mostly because she'd been one of the few adults who'd seen potential in a quiet kid who spent lunch periods in the computer lab. "Stephen," she said warmly, pulling me into a quick hug. "Thank you again for everything. The new computer lab is absolutely incredible." The kids are learning programming languages I've never even heard of. She turned to the group around us. You all should be very proud of your classmate. Stephen has single-handedly revolutionized our technology program. The scholarships he's funded have sent 12 students to college over the past 3 years. Mrs. Davidson continued talking, but I was watching my classmates' faces. The confident smirks had disappeared, replaced by expressions that ranged from confused and embarrassed to calculating. Scholarships, Miranda repeated. Oh, yes, Mrs. Davidson said. Stephen is too modest to talk about it, but he's one of our most generous donors. The new STEM Center is named after his mother. You know, such a sweet tribute. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest at the mention of my mom. She'd passed away 3 years ago, and naming the center after her had been one of the easiest decisions I'd ever made. She'd always believed that education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Mrs. Davidson excused herself to greet other former students, leaving our group in another uncomfortable silence. Stephen, Miranda said slowly, I think we may have misunderstood some things. What things? I asked, genuinely curious about how she was going to handle this. Well, I mean, she gestured vaguely at my clothes. You're dressed so casually. These are comfortable clothes, I said. I like being comfortable. Brad was staring at his phone, apparently reading more about my company's acquisition. Steve, it says here you founded CloudSync Solutions. That was your company. Still is, technically. Google kept the name and most of the team when they acquired us. Acquired for $47 million, Jessica said, like she was testing the words to see if they felt real. Plus earnouts based on integration milestones. I said, but who's counting? The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This wasn't confusion or disbelief anymore. This was the sound of people realizing they'd been making assumptions based on incomplete data, and that their assumptions had led them to treat someone poorly. I wasn't angry exactly. I'd learned long ago that anger was usually just hurt wearing a disguise, and I wasn't hurt either. I was more curious about how they'd handle this new information, curious about whether they'd double down on their behavior or try to course correct. Why didn't you say anything? Brad asked. Say what? That I could afford a more expensive t-shirt? That seemed important to you, not to me. Miranda laughed nervously. Right, of course. It's just, most people in your position would want people to know. Why? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Why would I want people to know? So they'd treat me differently? So they'd be nice to me because I had money instead of because I was worth being nice to? So I could watch them calculate their words and wonder whether they were talking to Stephen or talking to Stephen's bank account. Before anyone could answer, Sarah Kim approached our group with 3 young people in tow. Sarah had been our class secretary and was now apparently on the reunion planning committee. Stephen, I'd like you to meet this year's scholarship recipients, she said. Emily, Marcus, and David. This is Stephen Jack, the donor who's making your college education possible. Emily, a petite girl with serious eyes and a firm handshake, stepped forward first. Mr. Jack, I can't thank you enough. MIT was just a dream before I received your scholarship. MIT? Jessica repeated faintly. Full ride, Marcus added. Computer science program. Mr. Jack said he wanted to invest in the next generation of innovators. David, who couldn't have been older than 18 but carried himself with quiet confidence, nodded. The scholarship covers everything. Tuition, room and board, even money for textbooks and equipment. Mr. Jack said education was too important to let money be a barrier. I watched my former classmates' faces as the teenagers talked about their plans, their gratitude, their excitement about the future. These kids reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for knowledge and opportunity, held back only by circumstances beyond their control. These 3 represent the top students from this year's graduating class, Sarah explained. Stephen has committed to funding full scholarships for the top 3 academic performers each year for the next decade. That's... Miranda started, then stopped, apparently doing math in her head. Roughly $2.1 million. I said helpfully, give or take, depending on tuition increases. Brad's face had gone completely pale. Steve, I had no idea. When we were talking earlier, I was just what? I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it, apparently realizing that there wasn't a good way to finish that sentence. The scholarship recipients excused themselves to get dinner, and Sarah moved on to introduce them to other alumni. I was left alone again with Miranda, Brad, and Jessica, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Where before I had been the object of their condescension, now I was clearly someone they needed to reassess. "I think I owe you an apology," Miranda said finally. "For what?" Well, for being a bitch, honestly. I made assumptions based on your clothes, and that was wrong. I appreciated the directness, even if it had taken $47 million in net worth for her to develop it. "We all make assumptions," I said. "The question is what we do when we realize we're wrong." As if summoned by my words, the hotel's catering director appeared beside me. "Mr. Jack, I want to confirm the timing for the surprise. Should we begin serving the upgraded dinner service now, or wait until after the scholarship presentation?" "Upgraded dinner service?" Brad asked. I'd arranged for the catering to be upgraded from the basic chicken or fish option to a full 5-course meal with wine pairings, but I'd asked them to handle it discreetly. Apparently, discreet had its limits. "Go ahead and start," I told the catering director, "and thank you for accommodating the last-minute changes." As he walked away, Jessica stared at me. "You upgraded everyone's dinner?" The original catering package was pretty basic. I thought people deserved better for their 20th reunion. "How much did that cost?" Brad asked, then immediately looked embarrassed for asking. "Does it matter?" He shook his head quickly. "No, of course not. It's just incredibly generous." I was beginning to understand that generosity looked different depending on your perspective. To them, upgrading dinner for 200 people was a grand gesture that proved my wealth. To me, it was the cost of ensuring that people had a good time at an event I'd already decided to fund. The real generosity was in scholarships, but those took years to appreciate. The upgraded food was immediate and visible. "Stephen Jack." I turned to find a woman with a camera and a press badge approaching. Local newspaper, probably based on the familiar way she navigated the crowd. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Herald," she said. "I was hoping to get a few minutes with you about your donations to the school district." "I prefer to keep those private," I said. "I understand, but the community deserves to know about the positive impact you're having. The new technology center, the scholarships, the after-school programming you funded. It's changing lives." I could feel Miranda, Brad, and Jessica listening to every word, their understanding of my situation expanding with each detail. The after-school programming was something I'd started quietly after learning that many students didn't have anywhere safe to go between the end of school and when their parents got home from work. $50,000 a year kept the building open, staffed, and stocked with computers, books, and healthy snacks. "Maybe we could do a brief interview?" Jennifer pressed. "Just 5 minutes about why education matters to you." I glanced around the room, taking in the faces of my former classmates. Some were stealing glances in my direction, probably trying to reconcile the quiet kid they remembered with the successful adult I'd become. Others were engaged in their own conversations, oblivious to the drama playing out in our small circle. "Not tonight," I said finally. "This is about celebrating our class, not about me." Jennifer nodded and handed me her business card. "When you're ready to tell your story, I hope you'll consider the Herald." After she left, Miranda looked at me with something approaching awe. "You really don't want the attention, do you?" "What's the point of attention?" "Recognition, respect, influence." "I have influence," I said. "Those 3 kids are going to MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon. They'll graduate without debt and build things that matter. That's influence. But people should know what you've done." "Why?" It was the same question I'd asked before, but this time Miranda really thought about it. "I guess so they'll appreciate it." "Do you think Emily appreciates her scholarship less because you didn't know I funded it?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, apparently realizing the flaw in her logic. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of silverware against crystal. Someone was calling for attention, probably to begin the formal program. As the crowd quieted, I saw Robert Martinez standing near the small stage that had been set up at one end of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we continue the evening's festivities, we'd like to take a moment to thank someone who made tonight possible." I felt a familiar sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't part of the plan. "This reunion almost didn't happen," Robert continued. "The venues we could afford weren't available, and the venues that were available were beyond our budget. But one member of your class stepped forward to ensure that your 20th reunion would be everything you deserved." The room had gone completely quiet. I could see people looking around, trying to figure out who Robert was talking about. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Mr. Stephen Jack, whose generosity funded this entire evening." The applause started slowly, tentatively, then built as people processed what they'd just heard. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, and I understood with sudden clarity why I'd avoided this kind of recognition my entire life. This wasn't about gratitude anymore. This was about revelation, about the gap between perception and reality, about the moment when assumptions collide with truth. I looked at Miranda, Brad, and Jessica, their faces showing various stages of mortification as they realized that their comments about my Walmart wardrobe had been made to the person who'd paid for them to be there in the first place. The applause continued, and I knew that everything that happened next would determine not just how this evening ended, but how these relationships would continue for years to come. The silence that followed the applause was deafening. I stood there, acutely aware that 200 pairs of eyes were on me, waiting for some kind of response. I'd given thousands of presentations to investors, board members, and tech conferences, but this felt different. This wasn't about business or technology. This was about people I'd grown up with, people who'd known me when I was nobody special, people who now had to reconcile their memories with the reality standing in front of them. "Thank you," I said simply, raising my hand in a small wave. "I hope everyone enjoys the evening." That was it. No grand speech, no moment of triumph, just acknowledgement and an invitation to move on. But I could see in their faces that moving on wasn't going to be that simple. As the formal program continued with the usual reunion activities, classmates who hadn't spoken to me in 20 years began gravitating in my direction. The conversations followed a predictable pattern: surprise, embarrassment, and then the inevitable recalculation of my social worth based on my financial worth. "Stephen, oh my God, I had no idea," said Kelly Matthews, who'd been homecoming queen and had ignored me completely in high school. "You're so humble. I would never have guessed." "Guess what?" I asked. "That you were so successful." There was that word again. Successful. As if success was measured only in dollars. As if the kid who'd spent lunch periods coding hadn't been successful at learning, or the teenager who'd worked weekends to help his mom hadn't been successful at responsibility. "I'm the same person I was in high school," I said. "But you're not, though," Kelly insisted. "You're a millionaire now. You own companies. You're important." I watched her face as she spoke, seeing the genuine confusion there. In her world, importance came from external validation, from titles and possessions and social status. The idea that someone could be important because of what they created or contributed, regardless of recognition, seemed foreign to her. "I was important then, too," I said quietly. "You just didn't notice." The comment landed harder than I'd intended. Kelly's face flushed, and she excused herself quickly. I hadn't meant to be cruel, but sometimes truth felt that way to people who'd never examined their own assumptions. Miranda appeared at my elbow, having waited for Kelly to leave. Her approach was different now, more careful, like she was talking to someone she didn't want to offend. "Stephen, I owe you a real apology," she said. "What I said earlier about your clothes, about being authentic, that was completely out of line." "Was it wrong?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I am authentic. I do dress comfortably." "You weren't wrong about the facts, Miranda. You were wrong about what those facts meant." She stared at me for a moment, processing this. "I assumed that because you dress simply, you couldn't afford to dress better. And that made you feel what exactly?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. I don't know. Superior, I guess. Like I'd done better in life than you had. And how does that feel now?" Miranda looked down at her expensive dress, her carefully applied makeup, her designer shoes. Pretty shallow, honestly. I nodded. The thing is, Miranda, you're not a shallow person. You're a real estate agent, which means you help people find homes. That's meaningful work. But you let yourself get caught up in thinking that what people own defines who they are. But doesn't it, though? At least a little? It was an honest question, and I respected her for asking it. What I own is a Honda Civic, some comfortable clothes, and a small cabin outside town. What I have is enough money to fund scholarships and donate to schools. Those are different things. Before Miranda could respond, Brad joined our conversation, looking like a man who'd been thinking hard about his earlier behavior. "Steve, I need to apologize, too," he said. "The comments about your clothes, about Casual Friday, that was just me being an ass." "Why do you think you did that?" Brad ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remember from high school when he was nervous before big games. "Honestly, because it made me feel better about myself. I've been struggling lately. Business has been tough. My wife and I are having problems, and I've been feeling like a failure. Seeing someone who looked less successful than me, it was reassuring, I guess." I appreciated his honesty. Brad had always been competitive, but he'd never been mean-spirited. The cruelty had come from his own pain, not from malice. "What kind of business are you in?" I asked. "Medical device sales. Or I was, until last month. My territory got cut, and I'm basically starting over." "That's tough." "Yeah. Well, life isn't a game where you keep winning just because you won in high school." There was real insight in that comment, the kind that only came from being knocked down a few times. "You know," I said carefully, "one of my portfolio companies is developing medical monitoring devices. They're always looking for experienced sales, people who understand the industry." Brad's eyes widened. Would you consider?" "Email me your resume," I said, pulling out my phone. "No promises, but I can make an introduction." I gave him my contact information, watching his face change as he realized that the person he'd mocked might actually be able to help him. It wasn't pity or charity. It was just recognizing that good people sometimes needed opportunities, and I was in a position to provide them. Jessica had been hovering nearby, clearly wanting to join the conversation, but uncertain how to approach me after her earlier comments about being comfortable with where I was in life. "Jessica," I said, acknowledging her presence. "Stephen, I don't even know what to say. I feel terrible about earlier." "Don't feel terrible. Feel curious." "Curious about what?" "About why you assume that someone dressed casually must be unsuccessful. About why success to you means demonstrating wealth rather than creating value." She thought about this for a moment. "I guess I've spent so long trying to prove that I belong in certain circles that I forgot there might be better circles to belong to." It was an insightful comment, the kind that suggested real self-reflection. "What circles do you want to belong to?" I asked. "Honestly, I'd love to be involved in educational initiatives. I was a teacher before I married David, and I miss working with kids. But David thinks it's beneath me now." "David thinks helping children is beneath you. He thinks volunteer work is what wives do when they can't find real careers." I filed that information away, recognizing the dynamics of a relationship where one person's identity had been subsumed by the other's expectations. "There's a lot of educational work that needs doing," I said, "and it's some of the most important work there is." Jessica's face lit up for the first time all evening. "Really? You don't think it's a waste of my education?" "Jessica, you were valedictorian. You got accepted to Stanford. The fact that you chose a different path doesn't make you less capable. It makes you experienced in making choices." Our conversation was interrupted by Principal Davidson returning with the 3 scholarship recipients in tow. "Stephen, the kids wanted to thank you again before the evening gets too late," she said. Emily, the MIT-bound student, stepped forward. "Mr. Jack, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about education being too important to let money be a barrier. I wanted you to know that I plan to pay it forward. When I'm successful in my career, I want to fund scholarships too." "That's the idea," I said. "Success isn't about accumulating wealth. It's about creating opportunities for others to succeed." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. My mom always said that the best way to thank someone for helping you is to help someone else. Your mom sounds wise. She cleans offices downtown, David added. Works 3 jobs to support our family. When she found out about the scholarship, she cried for an hour. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that came whenever I was reminded of parents working multiple jobs to give their children opportunities. My own mom had done the same thing, picking up extra shifts so I could have a computer at home, so I could take programming classes, so I could dream bigger than our circumstances suggested. Give your mom my regards, I said. Tell her that her son is going to do great things, and that she should be proud of the job she's done raising him. As the scholarship recipients moved on to enjoy the rest of the evening, I noticed that our small group had attracted attention from other classmates. Some approached with genuine warmth. People I'd been friendly with in high school who were simply happy to see me doing well. Others hung back, probably doing the same mental calculations that Miranda, Brad, and Jessica had gone through. Stephen. The voice belonged to Amy Chun, Jessica's younger sister who graduated 2 years behind us. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital and had always been kind to everyone, regardless of social status. Amy, good to see you, I said, giving her a genuine hug. I heard about the scholarships in the technology center, she said. That's incredible. The whole town is talking about it. I hope they're talking about the students, not about me. Amy laughed. Well, both. But mostly about how these kids are getting opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Do you know that Emily's parents were planning to remortgage their house to send her to community college? Now she's going to MIT with everything paid for. I didn't know that detail, but it didn't surprise me. I'd grown up watching families make impossible choices between financial stability and their children's education. The scholarship program was designed to eliminate those choices, at least for a few deserving students each year. Education changes everything, I said. It's the one investment that always pays dividends. Speaking of which, Amy said, lowering her voice, I hope you don't mind, but I've been telling some of the nurses at work about your after-school program. We've been thinking about volunteering to help with homework and maybe teaching some basic health and nutrition classes. This was exactly the kind of community engagement I'd hoped the program would inspire. The goal wasn't just to provide a safe space for kids after school, but to create a network of adults who cared about their success. That would be incredible, I said. Talk to Mrs. Davidson about coordinating schedules. I think you'll find there's a lot of interest in that kind of programming. As Amy moved on to catch up with other classmates, I found myself thinking about the difference between recognition and impact. All evening, people have been focused on recognizing my wealth, but the real impact was in the stories Amy was telling, in Emily's plans to pay it forward, in Marcus's mother working 3 jobs and crying with relief. Stephen, the voice was softer this time, hesitant. I turned to see Sarah Kim, the reunion committee member who'd introduced me to the scholarship recipients. Sarah, I wanted to thank you personally, she said, not just for funding the reunion, but for everything you've done for the school. My daughter is a sophomore there now, and she talks about the technology center constantly. She's learning coding because of the equipment you donated. That's wonderful. Is she enjoying it? She loves it. She's actually talking about studying computer science in college, which never would have occurred to her before. You've literally changed her life trajectory. This was the kind of success that mattered, not the dollar amount of the donation, but the 15-year-old girl who was discovering she could build things with code, who was imagining a future she'd never considered before. What's her name? I asked. Jennifer. Jenny. Tell Jenny that as she keeps coding and decides to apply for internships in high school, I know some companies that are always looking for promising students. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You do that. Sarah, I was Jenny once. I was a kid who discovered programming and realized I could create things that mattered. The only difference between her and me is that I got lucky with timing and investors. She deserves the same opportunities one had. Before Sarah could respond, the lights dimmed slightly and music began playing. The reunion was transitioning from dinner and speeches to the more social portions of the evening. I could see couples moving toward the dance floor, small groups forming around high-top tables, and the bar area becoming more crowded. "Stephen?" Miranda appeared beside me again, but this time she wasn't alone. She brought Jessica and a woman I didn't immediately recognize. "This is Dr. Patricia Winters," Miranda said. "She's a superintendent of schools now." Dr. Winters extended her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to important conversations. "Mr. Jack, I've been hoping to meet you all evening. I want to discuss some ideas for expanding the programs you've already funded." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. This was someone who got things done. "What kind of expansion?" "Well, the success of your technology center has other districts asking questions. I've had calls from 5 different superintendents wanting to know how they could implement similar programs. I was hoping we might discuss the possibility of creating a regional initiative." This was interesting. I'd expected the local impact, but the idea that other communities might benefit hadn't occurred to me. What would that look like? A foundation, essentially, funding technology centers, scholarship programs, and after-school initiatives across multiple districts. With your success in technology and your obvious commitment to education, you'd be the ideal person to lead something like that. I could see Miranda and Jessica listening intently, probably realizing that the person they dismissed was being asked to take on even larger responsibilities. "I'd need to think about that," I said. "Running a foundation is different from making donations. It requires infrastructure, oversight, long-term planning." "Of course," Dr. Winters said, "but consider the impact. Instead of helping 3 students per year, you could be helping hundreds. Instead of 1 technology center, you could fund dozens." The scale was appealing, but it would also mean becoming a public figure in a way I'd carefully avoided. Foundations required boards, publicity, fundraising from other donors. It would mean giving up the anonymity that allowed me to make decisions based purely on impact rather than recognition. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "Can we schedule a time to discuss details?" Dr. Winters handed me her business card. "Absolutely. And Mr. Jack, thank you for what you've already done. You've reminded a lot of people that success is about what you give back, not what you accumulate." As she moved on to speak with other alumni, I found myself surrounded by the same group that had mocked my clothes earlier in the evening. But the dynamic had completely changed. They weren't looking at me with condescension anymore. They were looking at me with something closer to awe, and I wasn't entirely comfortable with that either. "Stephen," Jessica said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Do you ever regret not showing off more? I mean, you could be driving a Ferrari and wearing a Rolex, and instead you're here in jeans and sneakers. Don't you want people to know how successful you are?" It was the question I'd been expecting all evening, the one that got at the heart of how they viewed success and recognition. "Jessica, what would happen if I showed up in a Ferrari?" She thought about it. "People would be impressed. They'd treat you with respect." "Because of the car?" "Well, yes. So they'd be respecting the car, not me. But the car would represent your success. Would it? Or would it represent my insecurity about whether people would respect me without the car?" The question seemed to hit her hard. I could see her thinking about her own choices, her own expensive clothes and jewelry, her own need to signal success through possessions. "I never thought of it that way," she said finally. "The people whose respect I want don't care what I drive," I continued. "They care about what I create, what I contribute, how I treat people. The people who only respect me because of what I own. Why would I want their respect?" Brad nodded slowly. "That's why you didn't tell us earlier. You wanted to see who we really were before we knew about your money." "I wanted to see who you really were, period. The money isn't who I am, Brad. It's just a tool that lets me do things I care about." "But it must change how you see yourself," Miranda insisted. "Knowing you can afford anything, knowing you have that kind of freedom." I considered this. It changes what I can do, not who I am. I still wake up thinking about problems I want to solve. I still get excited about building new things. I still care about helping people who remind me of myself at their age. The main difference is that now I can act on those impulses without worrying about paying rent. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone tapping a microphone. Robert Martinez was back at the small stage, apparently ready to make another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more presentation this evening. Mr. Jack has asked to say a few words about the scholarship program. I felt a familiar sinking sensation. This wasn't something I had planned, and public speaking about personal matters wasn't something I enjoyed. But I could see the scholarship recipients near the stage, and I realized this wasn't about me. This was about them, about their futures, about the message we were sending to other students who might be watching. I made my way to the stage, acutely aware that the room had gone quiet again. 200 faces turned toward me, waiting to hear what the quiet kid from their high school class had to say about success and opportunity and giving back. I took the microphone and looked out at the crowd, seeing the mix of curiosity, respect, and calculation in their eyes. Some of these people had ignored me for 4 years of high school and 20 years since. Others had been genuine friends who'd simply lost touch. A few had been cruel, and others had been kind. But all of them were here tonight, part of the same community that had shaped who we'd become. 20 years ago, I graduated from the same high school as all of you. I was the kid who ate lunch in computer lab, who wore hand-me-downs, who worked weekends at the grocery store. Some of you knew me well. Others barely knew I existed. Tonight, a few of you discovered that I'd done well financially, and suddenly I became more interesting to you. I want to talk about why that bothers me. I could feel the tension in the room, the awareness that this wasn't going to be a typical thank you speech. It bothers me because it suggests that a person's worth is determined by their net worth. That the kid who was worth knowing in 1999 is the same person who's worth knowing in 2019, regardless of what's in his bank account. Emily, Marcus, and David are brilliant, driven, compassionate young people. They were brilliant, driven, and compassionate before I funded their scholarships, and they'll be brilliant, driven, and compassionate after they graduate from college. The money doesn't make them valuable. It just removes the barriers that might have prevented them from reaching their potential. I paused, seeing some nodding heads and some uncomfortable faces. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad about your earlier reactions. I'm telling you this because I want you to think about how you evaluate people, how you define success, and what you teach your children about what matters. The most successful person I ever knew was my mother, who worked double shifts as a nurse's aide so I could have a computer at home. She never made more than $30,000 a year, but she changed my life in ways that no amount of money could. That's success. I could see Emily, Marcus, and David near the front, listening intently. This message was really for them, for the moment when they'd face their own choices about how to define and demonstrate success. The scholarship program isn't charity. It's an investment in people who remind me of myself at their age, people who have the drive and ability to build things that matter, but who face financial barriers to their education. When Emily graduates from MIT and starts her own company, when Marcus develops medical devices that save lives, when David creates educational software that helps other kids learn, that's when this investment pays dividends. I handed the microphone back to Robert and stepped down from the stage. The applause that followed felt different from the earlier recognition. This felt like understanding, like people grappling with ideas that challenge their assumptions about success and worth. As I made my way back through the crowd, classmates approached me with different energy. The conversations were more thoughtful, more genuine. People asked about the scholarship criteria, about the after-school program, about how they might get involved in educational initiatives. A few apologized again for their earlier behavior, but most seemed more interested in moving forward than dwelling on past mistakes. That was brave, Amy Chin said as I passed her table. And necessary. Some of these people needed to hear that. We all need to hear it sometimes. I replied, myself included. The rest of the evening passed more comfortably. I danced with a few former classmates, had genuine conversations about families and careers and dreams, and watched the scholarship recipients enjoy being celebrated for their achievements rather than their need for financial assistance. As the evening wound down, Miranda, Brad, and Jessica found me near the coat check. "Stephen," Miranda said, "I wanted to thank you for tonight, not just for funding it, but for what you set up there. I've been thinking about what success means, and I realize I've been measuring it all wrong. We all have moments when we need to recalibrate." I said, "I've been thinking too," Brad added. about my kids, about what I'm teaching them about success and competition, and treating people with respect. I don't want them to think that being better than someone else is the same as being good. Jessica nodded. I'm going to talk to David about volunteering for educational programs. And if he doesn't understand why that's important, well, maybe that's a conversation we need to have. I watched their faces as they spoke, seeing real reflection rather than just social contrition. People could change, could grow, could recognize their mistakes, and choose different paths. It was one of the most hopeful things about human nature. You know, I said, there's always room for more people who want to help kids succeed. If any of you are serious about getting involved, let me know. There's more work than I can handle alone. As I drove home that night in my Honda Civic, I thought about the evening's revelations and conversations. The reunion had started with assumptions and mockery, evolved through embarrassment and recalculation, and ended with genuine dialogue about values and priorities. I thought about Emily, Marcus, and David, about the lives they'd build and the contributions they'd make. I thought about the other students who would benefit from the Technology Center, the after-school program, the scholarships yet to be awarded. I thought about Dr. Winter's proposal for a regional foundation, about the possibility of expanding impact beyond our small community. Most of all, I thought about my mother, about the sacrifices she'd made and the values she'd instilled. She'd taught me that success wasn't about impressing people, but about improving them. That wealth wasn't about accumulating possessions, but about creating opportunities. 3 months later, I received an email from Emily at MIT. She was excelling in her classes, had joined a research project developing educational software, and had started a nonprofit to teach coding to elementary school students in underserved communities. At 18, she was already paying it forward. Marcus had started a blog documenting his pre-med studies, sharing resources and encouragement with other first-generation college students. His writing was thoughtful and inspiring, the voice of someone who understood both opportunity and responsibility. David had declared a double major in computer science and education, planning to develop technology that would make learning more accessible to students with disabilities. His professors were already calling him exceptional. The Technology Center had expanded its programming to include weekend workshops for adults, evening classes for working parents who wanted to learn new skills, and summer camps for elementary students. What had started as a way to give teenagers access to modern equipment had evolved into a community resource that served learners of all ages. I did eventually meet with Dr. Winters about the regional foundation. After months of planning and legal work, we launched the Midwest Education Innovation Foundation with an initial endowment of $10 million. The foundation would fund technology centers, scholarship programs, teacher training, and innovative educational projects across 5 states. Brad took the job with my portfolio company and turned out to be exactly the kind of sales professional they needed. His experience with rejection and failure had made him more empathetic with clients and more persistent in finding solutions. Within 6 months, he'd become one of their top performers. Jessica did volunteer for the after-school program. Despite her husband's objections, she developed a reading comprehension curriculum that was so effective it was adopted by 3 other districts. The work reignited her passion for education and gave her the confidence to consider returning to teaching. Miranda started a program connecting real estate professionals with nonprofit organizations, helping them find affordable space for community programs. It was profitable for the agents involved and valuable for the organizations, the kind of win-win thinking that created sustainable solutions. A year after the reunion, I received an invitation to speak at my old high school's graduation. I stood at the podium, looking out at 200 18-year-olds who were preparing to make their own choices about success and contribution, and I told them about Emily, Marcus, and David. I told them about the importance of education, about the power of quiet determination, about the difference between being important and needing people to know you're important. But mostly, I told them about my mother, about the nurse's aide who never made more than $30,000 a year, but who changed the world by raising a son who learned that true wealth comes from lifting others up. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me. She was shy, dressed simply, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to be proud despite modest circumstances. "Mr. Jack," she said, "I wanted to thank you for the scholarship. I'm going to study engineering at State, and I plan to come back and teach here someday. I looked at her serious young face, at the determination and gratitude in her eyes, and I saw myself 20 years ago. I saw the future of our community, the next generation of problem solvers and innovators and quiet leaders who would build things that mattered. What's your name? I asked. Maria Santos. Maria, 5 years from now, when you're designing bridges or developing new technologies or teaching the next group of students, remember this moment. Remember that your success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you create and who you lift up along the way. She nodded solemnly, the way young people do when they're trying to memorize wisdom they're not quite old enough to fully understand. As I drove home that evening, I thought about cycles and investments and the compound interest opportunity. 20 years ago, I've been the quiet kid with hand-me-down clothes and big dreams. Tonight, I'd watch Maria Santos receive the same kind of chance I've been given, the same kind of chance Emily, Marcus, and David had received. The reunion had taught me something important about recognition and respect, about the difference between being valued for what you have and being valued for who you are. But more than that, it had reminded me that success isn't a destination you reach, but a direction you choose, not a prize you win, but a responsibility you accept. I never did buy expensive clothes or a flashy car. I still drive my Honda Civic, still wear comfortable jeans and simple t-shirts. But now I understand that these choices aren't about rejecting success. They're about defining it accurately. Success is Maria Santos going to engineering school. Success is Emily teaching coding to elementary students. Success is Marcus inspiring other first-generation college students. Success is a technology center bustling with learners of all ages. The after-school program providing safe space and opportunity. The foundation expanding educational access across 5 states. Success is quiet, patient, and generous. It builds bridges instead of walls, creates opportunities instead of showcasing them, and measures impact in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. And sometimes, success is having the courage to wear a $12 t-shirt to your high school reunion and letting people discover that what you're wearing matters far less than what you're doing with your life. Assumptions collide with truth. I looked at Miranda, Brad, and Jessica, their faces showing various stages of mortification as they realized that their comments about my Walmart wardrobe had been made to the person who'd paid for them to be there in the first place. The applause continued, and I knew that everything that happened next would determine not just how this evening ended, but how these relationships would continue for years to come.